One minute I was admiring my freshly installed iron fence, feeling like a responsible adult. The next, a woman in a hot pink blazer stormed across my lawn like I'd committed a federal offense. She wasn't there to welcome me or compliment my landscaping. She was there to declare war. Apparently, the HOA president believed my fence violated some sacred suburban doctrine, and within minutes, she had a clipboard, a shriek loud enough to scare birds off power lines, and a threat to call the police, which she did. I thought I moved here for peace and privacy, not public meltdowns over metal bars. Have you ever had a neighbor treat your home improvement like an act of rebellion? Drop a comment below. I'd love to hear how your HOA nightmares compare. As for me, that fence wasn't just iron. It was a lit match thrown into a dry pile of drama. 2 months ago, I moved to Willowbrook Heights, a beautiful suburb in Texas where the houses were spacious and iron fences were pretty much standard. Coming from my cramped San Francisco apartment, this felt like paradise. I work remotely as a software engineer, so having a peaceful place to focus was exactly what I needed. The neighborhood seemed perfect, well-maintained lawns, friendly waves from neighbors, and that quintessential American dream vibe I'd been chasing. A week in, Mrs. Lucille brought me lemonade and gave me what I thought was just friendly advice. "You seem nice, so here's your welcome and your warning," she said with a conspiratorial whisper. "Steer clear of Nancy Pickering. That woman thinks she runs this place like her own personal kingdom." I laughed it off at the time, thinking every neighborhood has one difficult person. I had no idea I was about to become Nancy's next target. After settling in, I decided to install an iron fence around my backyard for privacy and security. Nothing crazy, just a standard 6-foot black iron fence with an automatic gate, the same style that half the neighborhood already had. My grandmother used to say, "A house without a gate is a house that's easy to invade," and those words stuck with me. The installation day started perfectly. A professional crew arrived with all the proper permits and HOA approvals I'd obtained weeks earlier. The fence was gorgeous, sleek black iron with clean lines that complemented my house beautifully. I was standing there admiring their work, thinking about how great it would be to have barbecues without feeling like I was on display, when I heard the storm approaching. And by storm, I mean Nancy Pickering. She walked like a military officer doing a surprise raid, her clipboard held like a weapon, her voice shrill enough to startle birds out of nearby trees. She came marching across my yard like she owned the place, and that's when something absolutely ridiculous happened. A small Yorkshire Terrier started barking at the commotion, and Nancy actually stopped, pointed at the dog, and screamed, "Quiet! I am the HOA here." The poor little dog blinked, let out what I swear was a confused fart, and ran away as fast as its tiny legs could carry it. I should have known right then that I was dealing with someone who thought she had authority over everything, including random neighborhood pets. Nancy was wearing a bright pink blazer that looked like it came from a discount store, plastic sandals that were clearly not meant for yard walking, and bleach blonde hair that screamed, "I do my own coloring at home." Her entire outfit was a study in trying too hard while spending too little. excuse me," she yelled, waving her arms dramatically like she was directing traffic. "This fence is totally inappropriate for our community. This looks like something you'd see around a prison in Silicon Valley." I turned around, confused because I'd followed every rule and gotten every approval. "Hi there, I'm Mason. I just moved in a couple months ago. Is there a problem?" I smiled politely and said, "Thanks, I did get the design inspiration from Fort Knox." She didn't appreciate my humor. Nancy planted her hands on her hips and glared at me like I'd just insulted her entire family. "I'm Nancy Pickering, HOA president, and this fence is way too industrial for our neighborhood standards. I know every homeowner here." That last comment would later prove to be hilariously ironic, but at the time it just sounded like another power trip. I pulled out my phone and showed her the approval emails and permits. "Actually, I have all the proper approvals from the HOA board. Everything's been cleared." Nancy's face turned red, clashing horribly with her pink blazer. "I don't care about your papers. I run this place, and I'm telling you this fence needs to go." The way she emphasized "run" made it sound like she thought she was the dictator of a small country rather than the president of a suburban HOA. Just as Nancy was getting warmed up, an elderly gentleman watering his garden heard the shouting and looked over. He took one look at Nancy and said loudly, "Again, Nancy?" before shaking his head and muttering as he walked toward his house, "Bless your soul, son. She's HOA in name, HOA in nightmare." The resignation in his voice told me everything I needed to know about Nancy's reputation in the neighborhood. Across the street, 2 teenage girls had their phones out recording the scene. I later found the clip on TikTok titled "Karen vs. Fence, Episode 1, with over 50,000 views. The whole neighborhood was apparently used to Nancy's dramatic outbursts, and they'd turned her into entertainment. The conversation escalated quickly from there. Nancy threatened to fine me $500 per day until I removed the fence, claimed she had the authority to force me out of the neighborhood, and generally acted like she was the queen of suburbia. I remained polite but firm, explaining that the fence was completely legal and properly approved. Nancy's voice got shriller with each word, and she kept pointing at my beautiful fence like it was some kind of eyesore, when in reality it was probably the nicest fence installation in the entire neighborhood. The contrast between her cheap, garish appearance and the elegant ironwork was almost poetic. Her pink blazer flapped dramatically in the wind as she stomped off like a rejected game show contestant, screaming at the top of her lungs, "You just made the biggest mistake of your life, Mason. You'll be begging me to let you stay in this neighborhood." As Nancy's voice echoed across the quiet suburban street, something nagged at me. Her name, Nancy Pickering. Why did that sound familiar? I just received a forwarded envelope from something called Langford Holdings addressed to someone with that name, but I'd been too busy dealing with the fence installation to pay attention to misdelivered mail. I stood there watching her dramatic exit, wondering what exactly I'd gotten myself into by moving to this seemingly peaceful neighborhood. But I had no idea that Nancy Pickering was about to turn my life into a psychological thriller, and I was about to discover weapons in this fight that I didn't even know I possessed. What happened next made me realize this wasn't just a neighborhood dispute. It was the beginning of psychological warfare. I was in my kitchen making coffee when I noticed movement outside. Nancy had returned, but this time she wasn't screaming or gesturing wildly. She was just standing at the edge of my property line, completely still, staring at my house with a notebook in her hand. For 3 full minutes, she didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there like a statue, taking notes on God knows what. When I checked my security cameras later, the footage was genuinely unsettling. This woman standing motionless in my yard in broad daylight, documenting things that only existed in her imagination. I was beginning to think this fence wasn't keeping people out, it was attracting predators. 48 hours later, the war officially began. I found a certified letter in my mailbox, a formal fine notice for $500 for what Nancy called an aesthetic violation that threatens community property values and neighborhood harmony. The letter included photos of my fence, taken from every conceivable angle, as if she'd spent hours documenting it like a crime scene. The official HOA letterhead made it look legitimate, but the angry tone and excessive use of capital letters gave away who had written it. The threat was clear. Daily fines would continue until I achieved compliance by removing my perfectly legal fence. I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all, but I also realized this woman was serious about making my life miserable. Nancy's harassment campaign kicked into high gear immediately. Every morning at exactly 6 a.m., she would appear in my yard with a clipboard, measuring tape, and what appeared to be a homemade inspection checklist. She'd walk around my fence taking measurements, photos, and notes like she was conducting some kind of official government survey. The woman had clearly appointed herself as the neighborhood's fence police, complete with her own made-up authority and regulations. She complained about everything from noise pollution from the metal when the wind blew to claiming the fence was somehow attracting undesirable elements to the area, though she never explained what these elements were supposed to be. But the really disturbing part came after dark. My security cameras caught Nancy returning at 3 a.m., standing motionless and staring through my fence with a flashlight, writing something in her notebook. The footage was genuinely unsettling. This woman standing in my yard in the middle of the night, just watching my house like some kind of suburban stalker. She would stand there for 10 or 15 minutes at a time, occasionally walking the perimeter and shining her light on different sections of the fence, documenting God knows what violations in the darkness. I found myself leaving lights on when I went to bed, genuinely unnerved by her stalker-like behavior. The whole situation was taking on the feel of a psychological thriller, with Nancy as the unhinged antagonist who couldn't be reasoned with. During one particularly low moment, I actually sat down and started writing a letter to a realtor about selling the house. Maybe Nancy was right. Maybe it would be easier to just move somewhere else and avoid this insanity altogether. I was halfway through writing about relocating due to neighborhood conflicts when I looked up and saw something that stopped me cold. There was a plate of homemade chocolate chip cookies sitting by my gate with a handwritten note that said, "Don't give up. Your fence is beautiful," in a child's careful handwriting. It was from the little girl down the street who had drawn me the picture, and seeing that simple act of kindness in the middle of Nancy's campaign of hatred gave me the strength I needed. I crumpled up the letter to the realtor and threw it away. I remembered something my grandmother had told me years ago. A house without a gate is a house that's easy to invade. She'd been talking about setting boundaries in life, not just property lines. Mrs. Hollis became my saving grace during this period. As a retired lawyer, she understood exactly what Nancy was doing and how inappropriate it was. During one of our fence-side conversations, she provided insight that helped me understand Nancy's psychology. Nancy isn't crazy because she hates people, Mrs. Hollis said thoughtfully, watching Nancy pace back and forth across the street with her clipboard. She's crazy because she's terrified of losing power. The HOA presidency is all she has left. That observation helped me realize that Nancy's behavior wasn't just random meanness. She was desperately clinging to the only authority she had left in her life, after losing everything else in her divorce. The harassment reached new levels of creativity and obsession. Nancy would show up in what she called her professional outfit, the same pink blazer every day, paired with different colored leggings, and always those plastic sandals that made squeaking sounds when she walked. She'd measure my fence height with what appeared to be a children's ruler, test the stability by shaking the iron bars, and take photos from angles that would make a crime scene photographer proud. When Amazon delivery drivers came to my house, she would intercept them in the street to ask invasive questions about what was being delivered and whether I was planning more unauthorized construction. The poor UPS driver started leaving packages at Mrs. Hollis's house because Nancy would literally chase him down the street with questions about my suspicious activities. One afternoon, a little girl from down the street knocked on my door and handed me a crayon drawing she'd made. It was a picture of my fence, with stick figures playing in the yard behind it, and at the bottom she'd written in careful block letters, "I drew your fence. I think it's prettier than Miss Nancy's house." The innocence of that gesture, the fact that a child could see the beauty in something Nancy was trying to paint as ugly, gave me the emotional strength I needed to keep fighting. This wasn't just about my property rights anymore. It was about protecting the community from Nancy's toxic influence and showing other neighbors that you didn't have to live in fear of her manufactured authority. Nancy announced an emergency HOA meeting specifically to address what she called the Mason problem and the threat to our community's standards. Flyers appeared on every door, calling for concerned residents to attend a discussion about dealing with non-compliant residents who threaten our neighborhood values and property investments. The melodrama was incredible. She was treating my legal fence like it was some kind of community crisis that required immediate intervention. I realized this had moved far beyond a simple disagreement about property aesthetics. Nancy had declared personal war, and she was determined to use every ounce of her HOA authority to destroy me. My phone buzzed with a text message that made my blood run cold. Police compliment filed, illegal construction and neighbor harassment, court date pending. Nancy had actually called the cops on me for installing a legal fence on my own property. Officer Rodriguez arrived, looking tired and resigned, like this wasn't his first rodeo with Nancy Pickering. "Ma'am, this is the 4th fence call this year," he said with barely concealed exasperation as Nancy came rushing out of her house. It was 10 a.m. on a Tuesday, and she was still in a pink nightgown with fuzzy slippers that had cartoon cats on them, her bleached hair sticking up in all directions like she'd stuck her finger in an electrical socket. But Nancy had come prepared for battle. She carried a measuring tape, a protractor that looked like it belonged in a middle school geometry class, and a manila folder full of what she called evidence of my crimes against the neighborhood. The contrast between her chaotic appearance and her serious demeanor would have been funny if it wasn't so disturbing. "Officer Rodriguez," Nancy began in her most authoritative voice, trying to sound like a prosecutor presenting a case to a jury. "This man has installed an illegal fence that's destroying our property values and violating multiple HOA regulations." She thrust her folder at him like she was presenting evidence of a major crime. When the officer asked if there were any actual victims of this alleged crime, Nancy actually threw herself down on the grass and started moaning dramatically like she was auditioning for a very bad community theater production. "I feel dizzy just looking at this fence. It's causing me severe emotional distress and anxiety attacks." She lay there writhing on the lawn, one hand pressed to her forehead in an exaggerated fainting pose, while Officer Rodriguez struggled to maintain his professional composure. Rodriguez opened Nancy's folder and flipped through her blurry photos and handwritten complaints with the patience of someone who dealt with this exact situation before. The photos were ridiculous. Close-ups of individual fence posts, artistic shots of the gate mechanism, and even pictures of the shadows the fence cast at different times of day. Meanwhile, I calmly produced my permits, HOA approvals, and insulation certificates from the licensed contractor. "Everything's completely legal, officer. I have all the proper documentation." Nancy's eyes went wide with disbelief as she struggled to get up from the grass, her pink nightgown now stained with dirt and her cartoon cat slippers covered in grass clippings. He's lying. He's a tech bro from California who thinks he can just move here and change everything. This is gentrification. The inspection that followed was almost comical. Rodriguez examined my fence with professional thoroughness, while Nancy provided running commentary about how it was destroying the neighborhood's aesthetic harmony and creating privacy violations for longtime residents. She pointed at the iron bars like they were prison walls, measured the height with her children's ruler to prove it exceeded regulations that didn't exist, and demanded Rodriguez arrest me for what she called aesthetic terrorism and intentional community disruption. The officer maintained his composure admirably, but I could see him struggling not to laugh when Nancy explained how my fence was part of a larger conspiracy by wealthy outsiders to gentrify a neighborhood that was already one of the most expensive in the area. As the situation escalated, more neighbors came out to watch the show, and their reactions told me everything I needed to know about Nancy's reputation. One neighbor, an older gentleman I'd seen around but never met, whispered to me conspiratorially, "We all know she's not right in the head, but who wants to fight the HOA? She's driven away 3 families already with this kind of harassment." His comment revealed something important. Nancy had been terrorizing this community through fear and intimidation, and people were afraid to stand up to her because they thought she had real power. The psychological pressure she'd been putting on everyone was starting to make sense. People weren't supporting her because they agreed with her. They were just too scared to oppose someone who wielded HOA authority like a weapon. "Ma'am," Rodriguez finally interrupted, his patience clearly wearing thin, "this fence is completely legal. Mr. Langford has all the proper permits and HOA approval. I cannot arrest someone for legal construction on their own property." Nancy's face went through a spectacular range of emotions: shock, denial, anger, and finally desperate rage that bordered on hysteria. "He's targeting single mothers. He's trying to force me out of my home. This is discrimination and harassment," she screamed, her voice reaching a pitch that probably disturbed dogs throughout the neighborhood. "You need to do your job and protect the community from people like him." Rodriguez looked like he was questioning his career choices as Nancy continued shrieking about corrupt cops and tech bro conspiracies while he tried to de-escalate the situation. After the police left, I stood alone in my driveway, looking at my beautiful fence and wondering if it was really worth all this drama. The weight of Nancy's harassment was starting to get to me, and I felt genuinely isolated and overwhelmed by her relentless campaign. I looked directly at one of my security cameras and said quietly, almost to myself, "Is this fence really worth it?" But even as I asked the question, I knew the answer. This wasn't about the fence anymore. It was about whether I was going to let Nancy Pickering destroy my life through intimidation, lies, and abuse of what little authority she had. As I walked back toward my house, Nancy emerged from her hiding spot behind a neighbor's car and approached me with that evil smile that was somehow more frightening than her screaming fits. "You think you won," she said in a voice barely above a whisper, but with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "I'm just getting started. By tomorrow, the whole neighborhood will know what kind of person you really are." I decided it was time to go full detective mode on Nancy Pickering. If she wanted to play dirty, I needed to understand exactly who I was dealing with and what weapons she had in her arsenal. Mrs. Hollis became my unofficial intelligence source, and her insights into Nancy's psychology were illuminating. "Nancy isn't crazy because she hates people," Mrs. Hollis explained during one of our morning coffee conversations, watching Nancy pace back and forth across the street with her ever-present clipboard. "She's crazy because she's terrified of losing power. The HOA presidency is all she has left after losing everything else." This perspective helped me understand that Nancy's behavior wasn't random meanness. It was desperation disguised as authority, and desperate people are always the most dangerous. My research into Nancy's situation revealed some disturbing patterns that painted a picture of systematic harassment. She had indeed driven away 3 families in the past year, with escalating campaigns that started with property disputes and ended with the families selling their houses just to escape her reign of terror. Mrs. Hollis showed me the documentation she'd been keeping, photos, emails, and witness statements from the previous victim. "The Johnsons were first," she explained, pulling out a thick folder. "Nancy decided their garden gnomes were inappropriate lawn decorations and made their lives hell for 6 months until they moved to Arizona. Then the Garcias, she claimed their kid's basketball hoop was a noise violation and called the police so many times they finally gave up and left. The pattern was clear and terrifying. Nancy had turned harassment into a systematic process for removing anyone she didn't like." I decided to fight back with my own systematic approach. I spent an entire evening creating what I called my Nancy violation chart, a color-coded spreadsheet documenting every HOA rule she was breaking. I used red highlighter to mark the serious violations, yellow for minor infractions, and green for potential future issues. The results were amazing. Nancy regularly parked her beat-up SUV on the grass instead of her driveway, left her trash cans out for days after pickup, had several unauthorized modifications to her rental property's exterior, and had painted her house that hideous pink color without getting proper approval. The irony was delicious. The person screaming about compliance was violating more rules than anyone else in the neighborhood. I printed out copies of the chart with photos and documentation, preparing my own case against the HOA president, who seemed to think rules only applied to other people. The security footage from my cameras revealed Nancy's true level of obsession and mental instability. She was now spending several hours each day stationed outside my fence, sometimes just standing and staring like a statue, other times talking to herself or having animated phone conversations about property destruction and community safety threats. But the most disturbing footage showed her nighttime activities. She would return to my property at different hours, always with her flashlight and notebook, documenting things that only existed in her imagination. One particularly bizarre incident showed her measuring the shadows cast by my fence at midnight, apparently trying to prove that they were somehow damaging neighboring properties even in complete darkness. While reviewing my family documents for ammunition in case Nancy escalated to legal action, I came across something that made my pulse quicken. There was that unopened letter on my desk from Langford Holdings Property Management that had been delivered to the wrong address and forwarded to me. I'd been too busy dealing with Nancy's harassment to pay attention to misdelivered mail. But now I was curious about why mail for Nancy Pickering was being sent to a company with my grandfather's last name. The letter was thick and official-looking, with multiple stamps indicating it had been through several forwarding attempts. When I opened it, my hands actually started shaking. It was a rent reminder notice for Nancy Pickering, along with documentation of 2 months of missed payments and a warning about potential eviction proceedings. The pieces started clicking together in my mind like a puzzle solving itself. My grandfather, Harold Langford, had been mentioned by the lawyers when I inherited his estate, along with some miscellaneous real estate holdings that I'd never bothered to investigate. Could it be possible that Nancy had been renting from my family without either of us knowing it? The thought was almost too perfect to believe, but I needed to know for sure. I called my real estate lawyer and explained the situation, asking him to pull my grandfather's property files and see if there was any connection to Nancy's address. "That's an interesting coincidence," he said thoughtfully. "Let me do some research and get back to you. If what you're suggesting is true, this could change everything about your situation with Mrs. Pickering." The breakthrough came when my lawyer called me back with news that would turn Nancy's world upside down. "I found something very interesting about your property situation," he said, and I could hear the excitement in his voice. "Your grandfather's name is all over the land records for that area. We need to meet immediately. You're going to want to see this in person." As I hung up the phone, I looked out at my beautiful fence and felt a surge of anticipation mixed with a desire for justice. Nancy Pickering had no idea what she was dealing with, and I was about to discover that I had weapons in this fight that were more powerful than anything she could imagine. The woman who had been trying to destroy my life might actually be paying me rent, and tomorrow's meeting was going to reveal just how much power I really had in this situation. Nancy had clearly decided that subtlety was no longer working, so she went completely nuclear with her harassment campaign. The fine notices escalated to $1,000 per day, accompanied by official-looking legal threats about property damage lawsuits and intentional infliction of emotional distress on longtime residents. She'd apparently hired a lawyer who was willing to take her money and pursue her delusional claims, creating documents that read like paranoid manifestos about aesthetic terrorism and systematic harassment of vulnerable community members. Nancy was also threatening to contact my employer. Somehow she'd discovered where I worked and was planning to report me for harassment of community members in hopes of getting me fired. The woman had turned destroying my life into her full-time occupation. The situation reached its emotional low point when I found myself sitting in my backyard at midnight, actually unscrewing the bolts that held my fence posts in place. Maybe Nancy was right. Maybe it would be easier to just give up and remove the fence that was causing so much trouble. I was halfway through removing the first post when I noticed something that stopped me cold, and there was a plate of homemade cookies sitting by my gate with a handwritten note that said, "Don't give up, we believe in you," in a child's careful handwriting, decorated with crayon drawings of flowers. It was from the little girl who had drawn me the picture, and seeing that simple act of kindness in the middle of Nancy's campaign of hatred gave me the strength I needed to put the bolts back and keep fighting. The big HOA meeting was Nancy's chance to present her case to the community, and she prepared for it like she was arguing before the Supreme Court. More than 20 neighbors packed into the community center, which was the largest turnout for an HOA meeting in years. Nancy had created a PowerPoint presentation that looked like something from a criminal prosecution, complete with enlarged photos of my fence labeled as Exhibit A, Community Threat, through Exhibit Z, Property Value Destruction. She wore what appeared to be her finest outfit, a navy blue blazer that was slightly less cheap than her usual pink one, and she'd even had her hair professionally styled for the occasion. When she called me an invasive force and a systematic threat to community values, she delivered the words with the dramatic intensity of a prosecutor describing a dangerous criminal to a jury. Mrs. Hollis's response was perfect and devastating. When Nancy finished her presentation about property values and community standards, Mrs. Hollis stood up slowly and said in her clear, authoritative voice, "A person who loves the law doesn't make themselves the law." The room went completely silent for a moment, and then something beautiful happened. Several neighbors started clapping. It wasn't a huge ovation, but it was enough to show that Nancy's power base was cracking, and that people were finally willing to stand up to her intimidation tactics. Mrs. Hollis had articulated what many people were thinking, but had been too afraid to say out loud, and her words carried the weight of someone who actually understood how laws and communities were supposed to work. The vote of no confidence in Nancy's leadership didn't pass, but it was close enough to terrify her and show that her reign of terror was coming to an end. Almost half the neighborhood had voted to remove her as HOA president, which meant her support was crumbling and people were finally seeing through her manufactured authority. As people filed out of the meeting, I could see Nancy frantically trying to rally her remaining supporters, promising shocking new evidence and revelations about Mason's true agenda that would vindicate her position. She was clearly planning something desperate, and I had the feeling that whatever came next would be her final attempt to destroy me before her power completely collapsed. I didn't have to wait long to find out what Nancy's next move would be. The next morning, I found legal papers taped to my fence like some kind of medieval declaration of war. Nancy Pickering versus Mason Langford. Intentional infliction of emotional distress. $50,000 in damages, plus immediate fence removal and punitive damages for systematic harassment and community disruption. She had actually filed a lawsuit claiming that my fence had caused her such severe psychological trauma that she deserved massive financial compensation for her suffering. The papers included a detailed account of her alleged injuries, including sleepless nights, anxiety attacks, fear for her safety in her own neighborhood, and loss of enjoyment of her property due to aesthetic pollution. Reading through Nancy's version of events was like entering an alternate reality, where installing a legal fence was equivalent to psychological warfare and domestic terrorism. The lawsuit changed everything. Nancy wasn't just being a difficult neighbor anymore, she was trying to destroy my life through the legal system with false claims and manufactured trauma. I met with my real estate lawyer to discuss defense strategies, and that's when everything clicked into place in the most satisfying way possible. When I brought in my grandfather's documents and explained the property ownership questions I'd been having, his eyes lit up with recognition and barely concealed excitement. "Harold Langford," he said, pulling out a thick file that looked like it contained years of documentation. "I handled some of his transactions back in the day. Your grandfather was quite the real estate investor in this area." As he opened the file and spread out a detailed property map, my jaw dropped. There, circled in red ink, was the exact address where Nancy Pickering lived. "You own the house your neighbor is renting," the lawyer said, with barely concealed glee, pointing to the highlighted address on the map. "Your grandfather purchased it as an investment property 15 years ago, and it's been managed through Langford Holdings ever since." The revelation hit me like a lightning bolt of pure justice. Nancy had been renting her house from my property management company for the past year, which meant she'd been paying rent to me without either of us knowing it. The property management company had been handling everything automatically, collecting rent, dealing with tenant issues, and managing the property while I remained completely unaware of my ownership. Nancy owed 2 months of back rent, had violated several lease terms with her unauthorized exterior modifications, and was technically facing eviction proceedings that had been put on hold due to legal complications. The irony was absolutely perfect and almost poetic in its justice. The woman who was trying to destroy my life for installing a fence on my own property was actually my tenant, living on my land and subject to my authority as her landlord. But I decided not to reveal this information immediately. Instead, I was going to plan the most spectacular response strategy in HOA history. I contacted the automated gate company and arranged for an upgrade to my existing system that would make my fence not just a barrier, but a symbol of real authority. The new system would include keycard access that would allow authorized residents to enter, while keeping unwanted visitors permanently locked out. The preparation phase felt like planning a military operation, and I threw myself into it with the enthusiasm of someone who finally had the ultimate weapon in a long war. I had the gate company install the most advanced system they offered: biometric scanners, keycard readers, a mobile app that would let me control access from anywhere in the world, and an automated announcement system that would politely inform unauthorized visitors that they were on private property. I printed out all the property ownership documents, prepared information packets for the media, and coordinated with Mrs. Hollis to ensure maximum neighborhood witnesses for the upcoming confrontation. The security cameras were repositioned for optimal coverage of what was about to become the most satisfying moment in neighborhood drama history. Nancy's desperation was becoming more obvious daily, and her behavior was reaching new levels of instability. Mrs. Hollis reported that Nancy had been making frantic phone calls to people outside the neighborhood, apparently trying to drum up support for what she was calling a community uprising against my systematic intimidation and property terrorism. She'd also been spotted measuring other neighbors' fences and taking photos of their properties, clearly looking for violations she could use to prove that enforcement was inconsistent and that I was being specifically targeted for persecution. Her behavior was becoming increasingly erratic. She'd started wearing the same pink blazer every day, like some kind of uniform, and neighbors reported seeing her walking around the neighborhood at odd hours, muttering to herself and taking notes in her ever-present clipboard about imaginary violations and community threats. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when Mrs. Hollis texted me with intelligence about Nancy's ultimate plan. She was organizing a protest for the next morning, complete with media coverage and supporters from outside the neighborhood who had been recruited through her social media campaign about property bullying and tech bro intimidation. Nancy had promised shocking revelations about my background and was planning to demand that I be removed from the neighborhood entirely for the safety and well-being of all residents. She had no idea that she was about to become the star of her own humiliation show, and I was going to make sure the whole neighborhood was there to witness the moment when Nancy Pickering discovered exactly who had the real power in this situation. Everything was in place for the perfect reveal. The gate system was installed and ready, the property ownership documents were prepared, and Nancy had unknowingly scheduled her own public destruction. Tomorrow was going to be the most interesting day in Willowbrook Heights history. Protest day arrived with Nancy in full dramatic form, and she'd clearly decided this was going to be her moment of ultimate triumph. She showed up at 8 a.m. wearing her brightest pink blazer paired with white pants, looking like she was dressed for a political campaign rally rather than a neighborhood dispute. 15 people had actually shown up to support her, mostly neighbors who'd been convinced by her lies about property values and community safety, plus a few outsiders she'd recruited from her social media campaign about tech bro invasion and property terrorism. They carried homemade signs with messages like "Stop Iron Fence Tyranny" and "Rich Tech Bros Go Home," and "Fences Divide Communities." Nancy had even rented a megaphone for the occasion, which she used to lead chants about protecting neighborhood values and standing up to bullies and intimidators. The local news van arrived right on schedule, because Nancy had contacted them about what she was calling a community uprising against systematic property harassment and intimidation. The reporter seemed initially interested in the story of neighbors banding together against an aggressive newcomer who was destroying community harmony, and Nancy played her part perfectly for the cameras. She gave an impassioned interview about how I was systematically destroying the community with my illegal fence and intimidation tactics against longtime residents and families. She claimed to represent ordinary families who were being pushed out by wealthy outsiders who didn't respect neighborhood traditions or community values. Nancy had clearly rehearsed her talking points, and she delivered them with the conviction of someone who actually believed her own lies and manufactured victimhood. I watched the whole circus from my kitchen window, waiting for the perfect moment to make my entrance and deliver the surprise that would change everything. Nancy was really working the crowd like a seasoned politician, using her megaphone to rally the protesters and giving additional interviews to the news crew about property terrorism and systematic harassment of vulnerable residents. The crowd was getting more energized with each speech, and Nancy seemed to be feeding off their energy like a performer at the peak of their career. She kept pointing at my fence like it was some kind of monument to oppression, explaining to anyone who would listen how it represented everything wrong with gentrification and tech bro culture invading traditional communities. The confrontation built slowly as Nancy worked up the courage to approach my property line and demand the dramatic moment that would make her a neighborhood hero. She'd been content to protest from the street, but the cameras were rolling, and she needed the kind of spectacular confrontation that would make her story go viral. "Mason Langford," she shouted through her megaphone, her voice cracking with manufactured authority and righteous indignation. "Come out here and face the community you're trying to destroy. Tear down this fence and apologize for what you've done to our neighborhood and our families." The crowd cheered enthusiastically, the cameras focused on my front door with anticipation, and I knew it was time for my entrance and the reveal that would destroy Nancy's entire world. "I have something to share with everyone," I announced as I stepped outside calmly, my voice carrying clearly across the crowd without needing any amplification. Nancy looked confident and triumphant, probably thinking I was about to apologize or make some kind of peace offering that would validate her months of harassment. The news reporter moved closer with her microphone, clearly expecting some kind of dramatic confrontation or public apology. Instead, I opened my folder and produced the property ownership documents my lawyer had prepared, along with copies of Nancy's rental agreement and eviction notices. "Nancy," I said, looking directly at her, as her confident smile began to waver with uncertainty. "You're renting from my property management company. I own the house you live in." The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode, and the crowd went completely silent as the implications sank in. The gate reveal was perfect theater and the ultimate symbol of who really had power in this situation. As Nancy tried to process what I'd just told her, her face cycling through confusion, denial, realization, and finally absolute horror, she instinctively moved toward my property, probably planning to physically attack me or destroy something in her rage and humiliation. That's when I walked calmly to the new control panel that had been installed next to my gate and pressed a single button with the satisfaction of someone who had been waiting months for this moment. The electronic lock engaged with a satisfying click, and the automated system's calm, polite voice announced clearly, "Access denied. Private property." Nancy threw herself against the iron bars like a caged animal, screaming, "I run this place. I am the HOA. I am the law here," while the crowd watched in stunned silence and growing embarrassment for her complete breakdown. "Private property," I said quietly, holding up the remote control for everyone to see, including the news cameras that were capturing every moment of Nancy's humiliation. "You should know that." The symbolism was impossible to miss, and absolutely perfect. Nancy trapped outside the very fence she'd been trying to destroy, while I stood inside my own property with the literal power to control who could enter. Someone in the crowd had started recording a live stream and commented perfectly, "That fence is actually beautiful, and it knows how to tell who should be allowed in and who shouldn't." The cameras captured every moment of Nancy's complete psychological breakdown as she pounded on the iron bars with her fists, screaming about conspiracy theories and demanding access to her neighborhood, while completely ignoring the fact that she was having a meltdown on someone else's property. Officer Rodriguez arrived to restore order, and I could see him struggling to keep a straight face as he tried to calm down a woman having a complete public meltdown over a property dispute she'd started herself and had now spectacularly lost. The news story shifted in real time from neighborhood uprising to HOA president discovers she's been harassing her own landlord for months. Nancy was forced to admit on camera that she hadn't known who owned her rental property, destroying her credibility completely and revealing her as someone who had been wielding authority she didn't understand over property she didn't own. Her supporters quietly slipped away, taking their protest signs with them, and leaving Nancy alone outside my fence, still gripping the iron bars like a prisoner in her own manufactured drama. The community had witnessed Nancy's complete humiliation, and there was no coming back from this level of public embarrassment and exposure of her lies. 3 months later, Nancy had moved away, unable to handle the shame of her spectacular defeat and the revelation that she'd been paying rent to the person she'd been trying to destroy. I was elected as the new HOA president, unanimously, and my first act was to reform the ridiculous rules that had allowed Nancy to harass so many families over the years. The Garcias, one of the families Nancy had driven away with her previous harassment campaigns, came back to visit and ended up deciding to move back to the neighborhood permanently. Their son was playing basketball in their driveway again, and when I walked by during my evening stroll, I waved and said, "Fences don't stop laughter." The kid grinned and shot another basket, and I realized that the community was finally healing from Nancy's reign of terror. The iron fence still stands strong, with an automated gate that works perfectly for legitimate residents who respect property rights and community standards. Every evening at sunset, the light reflects off the black iron in a way that's genuinely beautiful, and I often stand in my garden just appreciating the peace and quiet that Nancy's departure has brought to our neighborhood. Mrs. Hollis still waves from her garden every morning, and we often share coffee while discussing the much calmer state of neighborhood politics. She told me recently that property values in the area have actually gone up since Nancy left, probably because potential buyers no longer have to worry about being harassed by a psychotic HOA president who didn't understand the difference between authority and bullying. Looking back on the whole ordeal, I realized that Nancy Pickering taught me an important lesson about standing up to bullies and people who abuse whatever small amount of power they've been given. She counted on people being too polite, too conflict-averse, or too intimidated to fight back against her harassment campaigns and manufactured authority. For months, she'd been the neighborhood tyrant, using her HOA position to terrorize anyone who didn't submit to her will or who represented change that threatened her fragile sense of control. But bullies only have as much power as people give them. And once the community saw her true nature and the reality of her situation, her reign of terror ended immediately and permanently. Sometimes the person you're fighting turns out to own more than just the fence they're complaining about. Sometimes they own the very ground you're standing on and paying rent for. The gate opens smoothly every morning as I leave for my daily coffee run and closes just as smoothly when I return. It's a simple pleasure, but one that represents something profound about property rights, community respect, and the importance of standing up for yourself when someone tries to make your life miserable for no good reason other than their own psychological issues. And sometimes, late at night, when I'm working in my home office, I look out at my fence gleaming in the moonlight and remember something my grandmother used to say: fences don't divide people, fear does. Nancy Pickering learned that lesson the hard way, and I hope her story serves as a warning to other would-be tyrants who think they can use manufactured authority to terrorize their neighbors and communities.